Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. I was waiting for sleep. It was always the same. That moment when the world falls quiet, when the weight of the day dissipates and the mind finally settles into its dark corner. But tonight, something felt different. Something heavy. A pull. A presence that clung to the air, thick and suffocating, even as the room remained still. I sat on the old, worn couch in my grandmother's house. It was familiar, too familiar, almost. The fabric beneath me felt like 1,000 whispers, each thread woven with memories I couldn't quite place. The scent of aged wood, dust, and something more, something that made my skin prickle in the most unsettling way, hung in the air. As the clock ticked away, the room around me seemed to grow colder, even though the heat was turned up to an unbearable level. I had been here countless times before, but tonight, the house felt different. It was as if the walls, the floor, even the couch itself were waiting for something. Or someone. Maybe I'm just tired, I thought, but that didn't explain the growing unease in my chest, the way my breath had become shallow and uneven. The dim light from the old lamp in the corner of the room flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. The glow of the bulb was weak, like it, too, was unsure of what was happening. My eyes wandered around the room, trying to anchor myself to something, anything, but the shadows seemed to twist unnaturally. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner, a faint shift, but when I blinked, it was gone. I shook my head. I was being ridiculous. It was just an old house. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The house was too quiet. And the quiet was too loud. There was a creak, a sound so faint it could have been the house settling, but it wasn't. The noise came from behind me, from the direction of the hallway. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The floorboards in the hall were old and brittle, and any sound of movement would be unmistakable. But this was different. This wasn't the sound of a floorboard groaning under weight. This was deliberate. I turned toward the hallway, my pulse racing. The dim light barely reached that far, and the shadows that stretched from the hallway seemed to press against the walls, as if they were alive, shifting and watching. I couldn't move. The only sound now was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the clock, each second dragging itself into the next. Tick, tick, tick. And then, a whisper. So soft, so faint, it could have been the wind or my imagination. But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. Who's there? My voice barely broke the silence, trembling as if it, too, was afraid of the answer. Silence. I waited. A long moment stretched between us, the shadows dancing, the house holding its breath. I tried to listen, to hear anything, another sound, another movement. But there was nothing. Just the quiet. And the growing, oppressive feeling that something was waiting in the dark. I shifted on the couch, the old fabric groaning under my weight. That sound, too, seemed to echo too loudly in the stillness. The whisper came again, this time clearer. Stay. Stay. I froze. I didn't recognize the voice. It was soft, melodic, almost soothing, but beneath the surface, there was something else. Something that made my stomach twist. I shouldn't have stayed, but I couldn't leave. My body refused to move. The couch had become too comfortable, its embrace too tight. It wasn't just the weight of the cushions beneath me anymore. It was as if the very air had thickened, becoming too dense to cut through. The shadows in the room shifted again, longer, darker now, stretching further across the walls. The sound of breathing, light and rhythmic, almost imperceptible, filled the room, though no one was in sight. My heart began to race. Sweat beaded on my forehead. Something wasn't right. There was something else in the room. Something watching me. And then, without warning, there was a sound behind me. A slow, deliberate step. I spun around, eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing. Just the couch. Just the room. Just the silence. But the air, the air was different now. It was heavier, thicker, and it pressed down on my chest like a weight, like 1,000 forgotten memories were clinging to me. The couch beneath me felt colder, and I couldn't tell if it was the room or my own fear causing the chill. I was no longer waiting for sleep. I was waiting for something else. Something that had been here long before me. Something that had made this couch its home. And it wasn't done with me yet. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, heavy, as though it were thickening with each passing second. Each inhalation felt like I was swallowing stones, and yet there was no escape. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows pressing closer, warping and shifting like a living thing. I wanted to stand, to run, but I couldn't. My legs were frozen, as though the very floor beneath me had come alive and wrapped itself around my ankles. The whisper had come again, but this time it wasn't a voice at all. It was a presence, a sensation that crawled under my skin, making my spine prickle with the weight of it. I stared into the hallway, where the darkness seemed to reach out, beckoning me, drawing me in. I could hear the faintest sound of shuffling from the corridor, the rustling of something moving, something alive. My heart pounded in my chest, loud enough to drown out the other sounds, but the fear clawed its way into my mind, into every fiber of my being. Stay. The word hung in the air like a command. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was a pulse, a beat that matched the rhythm of my own heart, hammering against my ribs. I shifted, trying to get a better grip on reality. Trying to make sense of the noise. It could be the house, I reasoned. Old houses creak, settle, shift. But even as I told myself that, I knew it was a lie. This wasn't the house. This wasn't something natural. A shadow flickered in the corner of my vision, just outside the reach of the dim light from the lamp. I turned my head sharply, but there was nothing. I was alone. Or so I thought. The whisper came again, only now it was louder, closer. The voice was no longer soft or melodic, but heavy and distorted, like it was being filtered through the very air itself. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the weight of them. Feel the menace in them, the suffocating pressure that coiled around me. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked behind me, but this time it wasn't the faint rustling of the house settling. No, it was a step. A deliberate step. One after the other, slow, measured, just a few feet behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I sat there, rigid, my eyes fixed straight ahead, staring at the shadows. My hands gripped the arms of the couch so tightly that my knuckles ached. The light flickered again, and in that brief, dark moment, I swore I saw something. No, someone. A figure, tall, thin, and impossibly twisted. It stood at the edge of the light, just beyond reach, and then, like smoke, it vanished into the hallway. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. I was aware of every detail, the creaking of the old wooden floor beneath me, the soft pulse of my heartbeat, the sensation of the couch enveloping me as though it were alive and holding me captive. It was as though the very room itself was breathing. I'm losing my mind, I thought. This isn't real. This is just exhaustion. It's just. But the silence that followed was unnatural. It was as though the house had stopped breathing, too. The shadows stretched, reached, and then, faintly at first, came the sound of whispering. It was impossible to understand, but it was unmistakably real. It was coming from the hallway. No, not from the hallway. From all around me. As though the very air had become a conduit for voices that had long been forgotten. The floor beneath me groaned, louder this time. Closer. The sensation of something, someone, was now so tangible I could almost feel its presence. I turned my head, slowly, cautiously. My pulse raced, my breath shallow and fast. And then, I saw it. The figure. It was there, standing just at the edge of the hallway, too tall, too thin, its limbs stretching unnaturally as though they were too long for its body. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes, hollow, watching, waiting. It was silent, but its presence screamed. Every inch of my body screamed at me to run, to get away, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The air had turned to thick, suffocating syrup, and the shadows had grown heavier, more oppressive, crawling toward me with each passing second. The figure took a step forward. I swallowed, my throat dry, my body trembling. My mind screamed at me to act, to fight back, but I couldn't. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred, and I was caught in the middle of it. Another step. Closer. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't exhaustion. The figure was real. It was coming for me. I was trapped. The couch had become a prison, the walls a barrier I couldn't escape. The whispers grew louder, their words no longer muffled, but distorted and jagged, as though they were coming from deep beneath the earth. Stay, it said again, only this time, the voice was not just a whisper. It was a command, a promise, an inevitability. It was everything I feared. Suddenly, the lamp flickered one last time before plunging the room into complete darkness. The shadows swallowed everything. There was nothing but the oppressive, suffocating silence. And then, the figure moved. I felt the weight of it as it came closer, its presence wrapping around me, tightening like a vice. My body screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. All I could do was sit there, frozen, helpless, waiting for what was next. And in the dark, I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. Something was coming, and I wasn't ready for it. The darkness was absolute. I could hear nothing. No whispers. No movements. No breaths. Only the hollow echo of my own pulse, thumping in my ears, each beat a reminder of how utterly alone I was in this suffocating silence. My hands gripped the couch so tightly that my fingers were numb. I tried to steady my breathing, but the air felt thick, oppressive, pressing in from all sides. I could no longer tell if my fear was born of the presence I felt or the suffocating claustrophobia of the darkness itself. My body ached to move, to flee, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as though the weight of the house, the years of history built into every creak of the floor, had rooted me in place. Every fiber of my being screamed to escape, to break free, but I was locked in this moment, this feeling, as if the room had become a tomb, one I could not leave. The figure was still there, lurking just beyond the reach of the shadows, but I couldn't see it clearly. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was more than that. It was like the darkness had become a part of it. The figure was the dark. The dark was the figure. They were one and the same. I blinked, willing my eyes to adjust, to make sense of what I was seeing, but the longer I stared, the more the room seemed to shift. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore, they were alive. They moved with intent, slithering and curling like smoke, twisting and pulling toward me. Suddenly, a noise broke through the silence, a soft, faint sound, like something scuttling across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I was no longer alone. The air seemed to vibrate with tension, the room closing in on me. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. It was coming closer, whatever it was. I could feel it now, its presence was undeniable. A shift in the air, the faintest brush of something cold against my skin. It was as if it were circling me, just beyond the edge of my awareness. Then, a low, rasping voice cut through the quiet. "Don't leave. It's not over." I knew that voice. The realization struck like a bolt of lightning. I knew that voice. It was my grandmother's. But that didn't make sense. She had been dead for years. "Grandma?" I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop it. It felt wrong, unnatural. My throat was dry, tight, and yet the words came out anyway. The darkness around me seemed to contract, pulling in closer, tighter, like a fist around my chest. "Stay with me," the voice said again, louder now, more urgent, more commanding. "It's not over. You have to remember. Remember." I tried to push the words away, but they stuck. Remember what? Remember who? The air thickened once more, heavier now, pressing on my chest, suffocating me with a sense of wrongness that seemed to seep from every corner of the room. It felt as though I were drowning in it. The walls of the room were closing in, pulling the couch closer and closer to the center of the room, trapping me. I turned my head, trying to scan the room, trying to find something familiar, anything to ground me, but the shadows were thick. They stretched, creeping along the floor, the walls, the ceiling, swallowing everything in their path. The room felt like it was bending, warping around me. And then, I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beside the doorway, there was a figure, the figure. Its shape was elongated, distorted, its limbs twisted unnaturally. Its face was impossible to see, hidden in the deep folds of the shadows. But I could feel its eyes, those cold, hollow eyes that stared right through me, and I knew, in that moment, that this wasn't just some figment of my imagination. This thing had been waiting. It had been waiting for me. A cold breeze swept across my face, and I felt a shiver run through me, though the air in the room should have been stifling. The whispers came again, rising, growing, flooding my senses. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something older. Something that had been here long before me. "Remember," the voice demanded, now sounding not like my grandmother, but something deeper, more ancient. "Remember what happened." And suddenly, without warning, I remembered. I remembered the stories. The old tales my grandmother had whispered when I was younger, just before bed. The stories about the house, about the spirits that lingered, trapped between the walls. The stories she had laughed off as old wives' tales, just stories. But they weren't just stories. They were real. And they were here. My grandmother's voice echoed in my ears, repeating those words again and again. You're not alone here. They never leave. The shadows twisted, and I felt something shift in the air, the room growing darker, colder. The air felt like it had been frozen, solidified, and in that instant, I knew that whatever this was, it was tied to the house, to the couch, to my family. The old couch beneath me groaned as though it had come to life, the cushions shifting, pressing into my back like 1,000 hands, tightening, pulling me into its embrace. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed. The whispers grew louder, more frantic now, like the voices of countless people all talking at once. Their words were a jumble of fear and regret, of memories that had been long buried. Help! Help me! It was my own voice now, a low, panicked whisper. But it wasn't just me. It was the voices of those who had sat in this very spot before me. The ones who had waited for the inevitable, for the pull of the past to come for them. They had waited. And now, it was my turn. The figure moved again, shifting from the corner of the room, slowly, deliberately, its limbs bending at impossible angles. It was coming for me. The darkness was closing in, and I had nowhere to run. I couldn't move. My body, once full of terror and adrenaline, now felt like stone. The darkness was no longer just a backdrop. It was a living thing, coiling around me, wrapping tighter and tighter with each passing second. The figure was still there, standing just outside the reach of the shadows, but its shape had changed. It was no longer simply distorted and unnaturally thin. It was growing, taking form, its silhouette sharpening into something I could almost recognize. My grandmother's voice echoed in my ears again, but now it wasn't just a whisper. It was a full command. Remember what you've forgotten. Remember what we all did. I tried to look away, to tear my gaze from the figure that loomed just in front of me, but it was as if the very room had locked me in place. I couldn't escape the suffocating weight of the shadows that pressed against my skin, that seemed to pull me in deeper. My pulse thudded against my temples, and with each beat, I could feel the very air around me vibrate with the power of whatever was inside this house. The whispers had shifted. They weren't just voices now. They were memories, fragmented and broken. The voices of the past had begun to fuse with my own thoughts, with my own fears. I could hear the faint sound of children laughing, of footsteps running down hallways. I could hear the sound of my grandmother's voice, low and melodic, but now it was laced with something darker, something more sinister. I closed my eyes, trying to block it all out, but that only made it worse. The darkness didn't care if I tried to ignore it. It was still there, pressing in, suffocating me. I felt the weight of it in my chest, the cold air creeping in from every corner, seeping into my skin like ice. The shadows weren't just around me. They were inside me. A shift in the air. I wasn't alone anymore. The figure was closer now, its long, twisted limbs moving in jerking motions, like something that had been stitched together and was trying to figure out how to walk. It wasn't fully human. It never had been. But there was something familiar about it. The figure's face, if you could call it that, remained obscured, but I felt its eyes on me. Cold, unblinking, and hungry. The tension in the room thickened, the weight of its gaze pressing against my skull like a vice. It took another step forward, and I could hear the sound of its feet dragging across the floor, the wet, sickening scrape of something not quite solid. "Please," I whispered, the words slipping from my lips without my permission. My voice felt small, fragile, as if it might shatter at any moment. "Help me," came the answer. It wasn't a voice I recognized this time. It was distant, distorted, like it was coming from the depths of the earth itself. The words were full of sorrow, of pain, and I could feel the weight of it in my bones. I knew, in that moment, that this was not just a presence, it was something that had been tied to this house for generations. It had been waiting for me, waiting for all of us. The walls around me seemed to pulse, breathing with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each breath came from somewhere deep within the house, from places I couldn't see, places I didn't want to know about. The air had become so thick, I could almost taste it. It tasted like dust. It tasted like rot. The figure stepped into the dim light, its form more solid now, more defined. Its arms were long, too long, reaching down toward the floor, fingers outstretched, each joint bending in a way that made my stomach churn. It wasn't human. Not anymore. And yet, there was something familiar about it. Something that clawed at the edges of my memory, teasing me, pushing me to remember. Remember. The voice was louder now. It wasn't just a whisper in the dark. It was an order, a plea, a command. "You know me. You know what we did." A flicker of recognition sparked in my mind, but it was gone before I could grasp it. Instead, I was left with a sense of dread, a growing feeling that something was slipping through my fingers. Something I had long forgotten. Something I didn't want to remember. The figure moved closer, its limbs moving in jerking, unnatural motions. Its presence filled the room now, the air thickening with the weight of its power. It leaned in toward me, its face still hidden in shadow, but I could feel its cold breath, feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me. And then, as if the very air itself had snapped, the darkness shifted. It was as if the room had suddenly tilted, as though the space itself was warping, twisting in on itself. I could hear the floorboards groaning beneath me, the walls creaking, shifting like they were alive. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My throat was dry, tight. I could feel my heart racing, each beat like a drum in my chest. Suddenly, I was no longer in the living room. I was in a hallway. A long, dark hallway that stretched before me, its walls lined with portraits, familiar faces staring out at me. Faces I knew, but couldn't place. The air smelled old, like dust and decay. The floor beneath me was cold, hard, and my feet shuffled against the floor, dragging as if they were too heavy to lift. I didn't understand how I had gotten here, but it didn't matter. The shadows were still there, creeping along the walls, stretching out toward me, and I knew that whatever was happening wasn't just a dream. This was real. The figure was behind me now. I could feel it moving closer, its presence pressing against my back like a weight I couldn't escape. "Turn around," it said, its voice now low, almost a growl. "You can't run from this." I didn't want to turn. I didn't want to face it. But I couldn't help it. My body moved without my permission, and slowly, ever so slowly, I turned around. And there, standing in front of me, was a mirror. But the reflection wasn't mine. It was my grandmother. I couldn't breathe. The figure in the mirror wasn't just my grandmother. It was her, but not her. Her face, her expression, was wrong. It was twisted in a way I had never seen before. Her eyes, once kind and warm, were now wide and vacant, like the deep black voids of a forgotten memory. Her lips were thin, pulled into a tight, unnatural smile that didn't match the sorrow in her eyes. It was as though her body was a mask, a hollow shell made to mimic her, but not truly her. And yet, I knew that this was her, or at least a version of her. The darkness around me seemed to pulse with an energy that made my skin crawl, and I felt the weight of her gaze like an anchor pulling me down, deeper into the abyss. I tried to look away, to close my eyes. But the mirror held me in place, its reflection more real than the room around me. My legs shook, and I could feel my pulse throbbing in my throat as the room seemed to tilt, the walls warping like the mirror itself was distorting reality. I reached a trembling hand out toward the glass, and as my fingertips brushed against it, something cold and slick coated my skin, as though the mirror itself were alive. My breath caught in my chest as I watched her move. Her reflection stepped closer to the glass, her hands reaching forward as if trying to break free of her own prison. But as her fingers pressed against the mirror, the glass shuddered violently, rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. I could feel the room around me trembling, as though the very foundation of the house was reacting to the movement, shaking with an energy I couldn't understand. "You shouldn't have come here," the reflection whispered. But it wasn't her voice anymore. It was deeper, darker, distorted, as if the house itself had taken her form. I stumbled back, a sharp, guttural gasp escaping my lips. The room was spinning. The shadows were closing in. I could hear the whispers again, rising and falling like waves crashing against my ears. "Don't look at her. Don't listen to her." But the words weren't mine. They were the voices of those who had lived here before me, those who had disappeared into the depths of the house, never to be seen again. "She's gone," the voices murmured. "We've all gone." I shook my head, trying to block out the sounds, trying to focus on something, anything other than the reflection in the mirror. But as I turned away, I found myself back in front of it again, unable to escape. "Why did you leave me?" the reflection asked, her voice full of desperation. The words felt like a knife to my heart, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of guilt. Why did I leave her? "I didn't leave you," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was answering the reflection or myself. My chest tightened as I struggled to recall the details, the faces, the pieces of a past I had buried deep within me. The memory was there, just on the edge of my mind, but it wouldn't come to the surface. It was too painful, too real. "You left me, just like the others," the reflection repeated, the tone of her voice becoming more frantic, more insistent. "You never came back. You left me alone." The walls seemed to close in even tighter now, the air growing heavier, colder. I could hear the creak of the house settling, the sound of something moving in the dark corners of the room. The shadowy figure was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting, watching. But it wasn't just watching me anymore. It was watching her. I looked back at the mirror, my reflection now consumed by the figure, the distorted version of my grandmother. Her face began to twist, her features stretching unnaturally as though she were being pulled apart, reshaped by some unseen hand. I could hear her bones crack, the sound like the breaking of old wood. Her smile grew wider, impossibly wide, and her eyes darkened, the hollow sockets sucking in the light around them. And then, as if a dam had broken, the memories came flooding back. I remembered the stories, my grandmother's warnings. The house, with its dark corners and hidden rooms, had always been more than it seemed. She had warned me, countless times, about the things that lingered in the shadows. The things that watched from within the walls, waiting for the right moment to strike. She had tried to protect me, but I hadn't listened. The truth came crashing down on me, and for the first time, I understood. The house wasn't just a home, it was a trap. A prison. The walls were alive, as much a part of the curse as the things that walked within them. The spirits, the memories, the voices, they were all part of the same twisted web, woven into the very foundation of the house. And I had been a part of it all along. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped back, away from the mirror, but it was no use. The room was suffocating me. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of the past. The walls seemed to close in, their creaks and groans now loud and deafening. The whispers were no longer just voices, they were the house itself, the screams of those who had never left, the echoes of the ones who had been consumed by the darkness. I turned to face the shadows, to confront whatever lay there, but there was nothing. The room was empty, silent. And then I saw it, a small, cracked object lying on the floor in the far corner. A ring, half buried in the dust. It was the same ring, the one my grandmother had worn. And suddenly, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The house had claimed her. And now, it was claiming me. It started with a question that lingered far longer than it should have. What if dreams could remember us? I had never been one to indulge in fantasies, but that thought gnawed at me for days after the dream. A strange, unsettling thought. Was it possible? Could something as intangible as a dream leave behind a trace? Something that could live beyond the moment, stretching out like a forgotten whisper? That was the day everything started to change. A day like any other, until I found the first symbol. I had always been a curious person, not afraid of the unknown, at least, not the kind of unknown that fit within the realms of logic. But this was different. The moment I stepped into that place, I knew something was wrong. The house, an old cottage on the outskirts of town, had been my family's for generations. It had always been a place of quiet comfort for me, a refuge where the world outside couldn't touch me. But lately, it felt like I was living inside someone else's dream. It was the smell that caught my attention first. A strange, metallic scent, faint but unmistakable. It filled the air, thick and oppressive, as I moved through the dimly lit hallways. The light seemed to struggle against the shadows, flickering at odd intervals. The house had always been quiet, but now the silence felt wrong. Not peaceful, but unnatural. There were sounds, small, almost imperceptible, but they set my nerves on edge. The soft creak of the floorboards under my feet, a distant tapping sound I couldn't place. And then, it happened. I found it on the floor by the hallway mirror, a symbol scrawled in what looked like charcoal or ash. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a mess, a random mark, perhaps a trick of the light, or a smear from some careless hand. But as I knelt down to examine it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something about it, something that felt familiar. But how? I had never seen it before. The shape was simple, almost geometric, a triangle with strange runes carved inside it. Each line seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't quite place. It was the kind of thing you dismiss as a figment of the mind if you weren't already a little off balance. I stood up quickly, my pulse racing. My head swam with the remnants of the dream, the dark void I'd fallen into the night before. The feeling of being trapped, of something always just out of sight, watching me. The memory lingered like fog, thickening in my chest. Was it real? I had to be imagining it. Surely, I had seen something like it before, perhaps in one of the old family books or on the walls of the attic. But no! This symbol, it was new, not a memory. And it wasn't just a mark. It felt like an invitation. A beckoning. I turned around, scanning the hallway, half expecting to see someone there, someone I hadn't heard approach. But the hallway was empty, silent. Still. The only movement was the slow, rhythmic creak of the floorboards, as though the house itself were sighing in its sleep. I moved quickly, away from the symbol, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. I needed air. I needed to get out of the house for a while, to clear my head. But as I reached the door, I noticed something else. Something far worse. The faintest scrape of a sound. So soft I could have missed it. But I didn't. It was coming from upstairs. I knew I was alone in the house. For a moment, I hesitated. The idea of exploring the source of that sound terrified me, but I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just walk away, not with that strange symbol still burned into my mind. My steps were slow, cautious, as I ascended the creaking staircase. The air grew colder with every step, the silence pressing on me like a weight. The hallway above was just as empty as the one below, but the feeling that something was wrong had only grown stronger. I walked past the rooms, each one as still and undisturbed as the last, until I reached the end of the hall, the door to the attic. The scraping sound was louder now. It was coming from behind that door. I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't make out what it was, whether it was the wind, the house settling, or something else entirely, but I knew I had to find out. I had to face it. The door creaked loudly as I turned the handle. I barely flinched as the sound echoed down the hall. It was as if the house itself were warning me. The attic was dark, colder than the rest of the house. I stepped inside, my feet crunching on something soft. And then I saw it. A shadow. At first, I thought it was just the angle of the light, the way the dust motes hung in the air. But then it shifted. A dark figure, almost human in shape, standing motionless against the far wall. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I tried to make out any details, but the figure remained a blur, as if the shadows themselves were obscuring it. I moved closer, my hand shaking, and that's when I saw it. A symbol, carved into the wall. Identical to the one in the hallway. Only this time, it was different. This one was not drawn in ash. It was burned into the wood. It felt as though the air had thickened around me, and I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave this place and never look back, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the mark, an imprint of something ancient, something beyond understanding. And then, as though a switch had been flipped, the silence was broken. A whisper, barely audible, like a breath against my ear. You shouldn't have seen that. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The attic was empty again, just like the rest of the house. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me in the shadows. Something that had always been there. And it was getting closer. The whisper echoed in my mind, but it wasn't just the sound that unsettled me. It was the feeling, the overwhelming sense that I had been invited into something dark and ancient. And as I stood in the attic, my hands trembling, I began to realize something terrifying. I wasn't alone anymore. I stumbled backward, my breath shallow. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, elongating like tendrils of something unseen. The air had grown thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was pressing in on me. The cold from the attic was seeping into my bones, but it wasn't just the temperature that made my skin crawl, it was the presence. Something was there, watching. I didn't turn to leave immediately. I couldn't. My feet seemed glued to the spot, and I couldn't look away from the symbol burned into the wall. It was too familiar now. The same as the one downstairs, but this one had a deeper meaning. It wasn't just a random mark, it was part of something larger, something that had always existed in this house, just waiting for someone to uncover it. The house groaned beneath my feet, as though it too were waking from a long slumber. The floorboards creaked loudly, but it wasn't the house settling, it was something else, something moving. A faint shuffling sound. It was so soft at first, I thought I imagined it. But then it grew louder, closer. I didn't know where it was coming from, but I couldn't shake the sensation that it was closing in on me. What was happening? My pulse quickened as my mind raced. There was no rational explanation for this. There couldn't be. And yet, every time I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that it was just the stress or the shadows playing tricks on me, the sensation deepened. The house wasn't just a home anymore. It had become a living thing, breathing, watching, waiting. I could feel the walls closing in on me, and my heart began to beat erratically. My breaths came in short, shallow gasps as I looked around the attic, desperate to find a reason for the fear gnawing at my insides. That's why I saw it. There, in the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed thickest, was another mark. This one wasn't as clear as the others. It was faded, almost as if it had been rubbed out over time. But I knew it was there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The same symbol. The same design. But there was something different about it. This one seemed incomplete. The lines were broken, jagged, like the figure that had carved it had been interrupted. Or had they left it that way intentionally? My hand reached out instinctively, trembling, the tip of my fingers brushing against the wall. The moment I touched it, the temperature dropped further, and the shadows seemed to writhe and twist around me. My breath hitched as the room grew darker, and the whisper returned, this time louder, clearer. You shouldn't have come here. I yanked my hand back, heart pounding. The voice, no, the presence, seemed to echo inside my skull. I spun around, but there was no one there. The attic was as empty as before, the shadows dancing in the corners like they always had. Yet, the air itself seemed to hum, vibrating with an energy that I couldn't place. I staggered toward the stairs, my legs shaking beneath me. The house felt wrong now, alien, as if I had crossed some threshold and could never go back. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but my feet wouldn't move. I had to understand what was happening. I had to understand why this was happening to me. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my eyes darting to every corner of the dimly lit hallway. The air was thick with a strange static, and every creak of the house seemed amplified in the silence. I had the overwhelming feeling that someone was behind me, watching. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. The house was suffocating. The walls seemed to close in with each breath I took, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was no way out. Not anymore. There were no answers, just the suffocating weight of the unknown pressing down on me. I took a step forward, my fingers brushing the banister as I descended. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the hallway, unsettling in its sharpness. Then, out of nowhere, a loud bang reverberated from upstairs. The sound of a door slamming open. My heart stopped. The attic door, the one I had just left, was wide open. I froze, not knowing whether to go back up, to confront whatever was waiting for me, or to turn and run out of the house altogether. But I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, paralyzed by the weight of something that lingered just beyond my comprehension. I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, approaching from above. Someone was coming. And then, just as quickly, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I strained my ears, trying to hear something, anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone anymore. The presence was right behind me. I turned slowly, my back pressed against the cold wooden railing. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if it too were waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Just the weight of silence pressing in from every direction. I could feel it, an oppressive heaviness that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. Am I losing my mind? My heart pounded loudly in my chest as I strained to listen. The footsteps were gone, but the feeling remained. It was like a presence was hovering just out of sight, watching, waiting. I wanted to call out, to shout for help, but the words caught in my throat. The house felt alive. It wasn't a building anymore. It had become something else, something older, darker. The floorboards creaked again, but this time it was different. The sound wasn't just in my head, it was real, undeniable. Footsteps. Slowly descending the stairs, deliberately, one step at a time. The heavy tread echoed in the hallway, rattling my nerves. I had to move. I had to find out what was causing this. But I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. It was as if the very air in the house was weighing me down, holding me in place. Then I heard it, a voice, soft, like a whisper carried by the wind. You should have never come back. It was familiar. The same voice I had heard earlier in the attic. But now it felt closer, as if it was speaking directly into my ear. My skin crawled, and I forced myself to take a step back. My pulse raced, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew they were there. Whoever, or whatever, was causing this, was right in front of me, concealed in the shadows. The hallway felt narrow now, the walls pressing in, the lights flickering in and out of focus, casting strange shapes that danced and twisted in the dim glow. This isn't real. It can't be. It has to be a nightmare. I closed my eyes for a moment, willing myself to wake up, to end this madness. But when I opened them, the shadows hadn't disappeared. They were still there, stretching, moving, like living creatures. And the presence, it was closer now. I could feel it, a suffocating pressure on my chest, as though someone was standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. I spun around, my heart leaping in my throat, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. What is this? What's happening to me? I was losing myself in this house, in these nightmares. I could feel it, that creeping dread, like I was sinking into something darker, something that would never let me escape. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But where could I go? The door to the kitchen slammed open, its hinges screeching in protest, and I froze. Something was in there. I could hear it now, a soft rustling, like someone moving slowly, deliberately. But there was no one. No figure, no shape. Just the sound of something shifting in the dark. Maybe it's just the wind. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. This was real. The house itself was changing, warping, becoming something unrecognizable. I took a hesitant step forward, my breath ragged, my chest tight. My feet moved almost of their own accord, pulling me toward the kitchen door. But I wasn't ready to face whatever waited inside. I stopped in the doorway, staring into the darkness beyond. The kitchen was empty, the shadows long and stretched, filling the room with a cold, unnerving stillness. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the dim light, something moved. It was quick, almost too fast to catch, but I saw it. A figure, or something like one, crouched low to the floor, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I gasped, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. But when I blinked, it was gone. Just like that. The air felt heavy again, thick with the scent of something unfamiliar. It smelled like damp earth, like decay. What was that? I turned and stumbled back into the hallway, my pulse hammering in my ears. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. I could still feel the presence, something following me, lurking just behind my shoulder, waiting for me to make the wrong move. My mind raced, the thoughts tumbling over each other, all pointing to one horrifying conclusion: this house wasn't just haunted, it was feeding off me. Every step I took, every breath I drew, seemed to make the presence stronger, more real. The walls closed in tighter, the shadows darker, until I could barely see anything at all. My hands trembled as I reached out for the nearest light switch, but it flickered and buzzed, barely illuminating the hallway. And then it happened. A loud bang echoed from upstairs. A door slamming open. I knew what it was before I heard it. The attic door. It had opened on its own. And the footsteps, slow, deliberate, began once more, climbing the stairs. It's coming for me. I could feel it now, that sharp sense of danger. It was close. So close. The presence, the thing that had been haunting me, was coming down the stairs. And there was nowhere to hide. I backed away slowly, my breath ragged, eyes wide with fear. But just as I reached the bottom of the stairs, the front door to the house slammed shut with a deafening crack. I was trapped. And then, from the shadows, I heard it. A voice, familiar yet chilling, whispering in the dark. It's too late. You're already ours. My breath caught in my throat as the voice echoed in the darkness, sending chills racing up my spine. I spun around, my eyes desperately scanning the now pitch-black hallway. I felt the oppressive weight of the air around me, thick with dread, pressing down on my chest. The silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the faint sound of my heart pounding in my ears. You're already ours. The words hung in the air like a curse. A promise. And in that moment, I understood that this place was no longer just a house. It was a prison. A prison that had been waiting for me. I tried to take a step back, but my legs felt unsteady, like they were sinking into the floor beneath me. The weight of the atmosphere was suffocating. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling as I tried to escape, but the door wouldn't budge. It was stuck, locked from the other side. Panic surged through me, and I pulled at the knob with all my strength, but it remained immovable. No. No, no, no. I turned back toward the stairs, my pulse quickening. The footsteps were louder now, closer. Slow. Measured. Each one sent a tremor through the air, vibrating the walls around me. It was coming closer. I had to think. There had to be another way out. I couldn't be trapped here. But where? The windows? I glanced at the windows in the hallway, but they were shut tight, their frames black with darkness, no light escaping through them. It was like the night had swallowed the entire house whole. The house felt alive. The walls pulsed with a low hum, like something beneath them was stirring, awakening from a long sleep. My fingers tingled, a strange static energy running through me, as though the house itself was feeding off my fear. And then I heard it, a soft scratching sound, like something dragging across the floorboards above. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was something else. Something crawling. My skin crawled in response, every hair on my body standing on end. I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel it. The thing in the attic, whatever it was coming for me. Slowly, it descended, each sound growing louder, more frantic. It was drawing closer, but not in a way that made sense. I could sense it now, not just with my ears, but with every part of me. The very air had thickened, become more oppressive, as though it were alive. I took a few shaky steps backward, my mind racing, searching for any escape, any way to get out. But my options were growing slimmer by the second. There was no way out through the door. No way out through the windows. The house was closing in on me, its walls pushing in from every side. What am I supposed to do? The light flickered above me, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls, moving like something alive. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure. Not just a shadow, but a shape, pale, indistinct, yet definitely there. My heart skipped a beat. I turned away quickly, trying to shake the image from my mind, but it only followed me. The presence. The force that had been watching me from the start was here, and it was closer than I realized. And then the stairs creaked. The soft, deliberate sound of someone moving down the steps. Slowly. Closer. Closer. I couldn't move. The fear had a grip on me so tight I couldn't even scream. I wanted to run, to fight, to escape, but my body refused to obey. My mind screamed for me to do something, anything, but I was paralyzed. The whispering voice returned, low and hissing in my ear, like it was right behind me. "We've been waiting for you." Suddenly, the lights above me went out, plunging the hallway into complete darkness. My breath hitched as I stumbled backward into the wall, feeling it press against my back. The cold from the stone walls seeped into my skin, making me shiver violently. I was trapped. There was nowhere left to run. The presence had surrounded me, and I was completely at its mercy. Then, from the darkness, a figure appeared. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow. But no, it was real. A figure, tall and thin, barely visible in the dark, with an unnatural presence that made every instinct inside me scream danger. I couldn't see its face, only a pale silhouette, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into me. And then, I saw the movement. It was dragging itself toward me, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles, like they didn't belong. The room seemed to tilt as the creature took another step. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. The air grew colder, and I could feel my breath fogging in front of me. It was coming closer. "You should have left," the voice whispered again, now coming from everywhere, reverberating in my skull, in my bones, in the very air around me. "Now, you belong to us." The figure reached out, its fingers long and twisted, like claws that scraped the air as they reached for me. The skin stretched tight over its bones, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on broken strings. And then, just as it was about to touch me, the lights flickered on again, revealing nothing. It was gone. But the air didn't feel lighter. It felt heavier, like the presence had only grown stronger. I could feel its weight pressing down on me, like it was watching from every corner of the house. I was caught in its web, and there was no escape. I stood there in the sudden brightness, trembling, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Had I really seen it? The creature, the thing that moved in the shadows? I could still feel its presence, the coldness in the air, the weight pressing against my chest. My legs felt numb, like they could give way at any moment, and yet I remained standing, frozen. It was gone, I told myself. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The house, no, this place, was alive. I could feel it breathing, pulsing in rhythm with my own heartbeat. Each breath I took seemed to draw me deeper into its trap, pulling me into its dark embrace, where the line between nightmare and reality blurred beyond recognition. I needed to leave. I had to. But where could I go? How could I escape something that wasn't just confined to the walls of this house? The air itself felt contaminated, soaked in fear and despair. The floors groaned beneath my feet, and the distant sound of something, or someone, moving above me seemed to echo in the silence. The attic. That cursed place had been the source of all of this, hadn't it? The dreams, the shadows, the cold. The things I had seen, felt, had come from that space above. It was more than just a room filled with forgotten relics. It was a vessel for the horror that had taken hold of me. I had to face it. I couldn't run any longer. My fingers grasped the edge of the door leading to the staircase, and I hesitated. The sounds from above grew louder, more distinct, almost like a whispering chorus that spoke in languages I couldn't understand. My pulse quickened. What was waiting for me up there? The house seemed to respond to my fear. The walls creaked, the windows rattled, and the dim light from the hallway flickered again, casting shadows that danced and writhed like serpents. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the images, but they were there, behind my eyelids, pressing against my mind. I forced myself to move, each step heavy as I ascended the stairs. The air grew thicker with each floor I climbed, and the temperature dropped, like I was walking through a veil of ice. My breath became shallow, ragged, as I reached the door to the attic. It was cracked open, just a little, as if inviting me in. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking uncontrollably. The second my fingers touched the cold metal, I felt it again, the presence. That same oppressive weight pressing down on me, tightening around my chest, making it hard to breathe. The house itself seemed to be alive, as though it were drawing me in, pulling me toward whatever was waiting on the other side. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to step into that darkness. But I had no choice. The door swung open with a groan, and I stepped inside. The attic was cold, colder than any place I'd ever been. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood and decay filled my nostrils. Cobwebs hung in every corner, and the faintest movement of shadows in the corners made my skin crawl. The floorboards creaked under my weight, as though something were shifting beneath them. I looked around, but there was nothing. No creature, no figure, just the silence. But it wasn't a normal silence. It was too silent, like the world had been muffled, as though the air itself was holding its breath. And then, I saw it. On the far side of the room, partially hidden in the shadows, was a mirror. It was old, its edges cracked and covered in dust, but the moment I laid eyes on it, I couldn't look away. Something about it seemed wrong. It was out of place, as if it didn't belong in this space, in this time. I slowly walked toward it, my heart pounding in my chest, and when I stood before it, I saw nothing. No reflection. Just darkness staring back at me. It wasn't real. That's what I told myself. But as my gaze fixed on the surface, I felt a shift, like something was moving just beneath it. My reflection wasn't right. It was distorted, like the glass was warping my image, bending it into shapes it shouldn't be. I reached out, trembling, my fingers brushing against the cold surface. The moment I touched it, I felt a jolt run through me, a shock, like electricity, that left my whole body numb. "You should not have come here." The voice, low and guttural, whispered from behind me, sending a chill down my spine. I spun around, but there was no one there. The attic was empty. Yet, the voice, clear and malicious, came again, louder this time. "You're already too late." The mirror's surface began to ripple, distorting like a liquid. The shadows around me seemed to shift, stretching, elongating, as though they were alive, hungry. The floor beneath me groaned, and suddenly the room felt as though it was tilting, as though it were twisting, changing. The attic was no longer just a room, it was a living thing, breathing, moving with a malevolent force. And then I saw it. In the reflection of the mirror, a figure stepped forward. A figure I knew all too well. It was me, but not. It was a twisted version of myself, a grotesque imitation, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that stretched impossibly wide. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my feet were frozen to the floor, my body unable to move. The figure in the mirror raised its hand, pointing at me. "You can never leave." The world around me collapsed in on itself, and everything went dark. Have you ever felt like the world beneath your feet is slowly crumbling, and you're just too late to do anything about it? It wasn't until that night that I truly understood the feeling. It began like any other, ordinary and calm. But when the first crack appeared, I should have known things would never be the same again. I was home alone, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as I moved through it. I should have felt safe. It was my house, after all. The walls knew me, the floors familiar beneath my feet. But there was something off. Something that scratched at the edges of my perception, whispering in ways I couldn't explain. I had been struggling lately, my thoughts tangled in uncertainty. The job was uninspiring, and the weight of my decisions seemed to haunt every waking moment. I had dreams, or perhaps they were more like nightmares. The kind that blur the line between sleep and reality, where I wake in a cold sweat, unsure whether the terror I felt had been real. And then it started. The first sign, small, almost unnoticeable, was a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow that wasn't quite right. I told myself it was just the dark. That the light from the hallway had caught the corner of a picture frame, or maybe the tree outside had shifted in the wind, casting strange shapes against the window. But the sensation didn't go away. It wasn't long before it happened again. I was sitting on the couch, staring at the dim light from the TV, trying to find something to distract myself. But the moment the silence settled around me, I heard it. A sound, so faint at first, I almost dismissed it. It was like a rustling, a shuffling, a soft scraping against the wooden floor. I turned my head quickly, but saw nothing. No one was there. Just the empty room filled with shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That something was moving just beyond the reach of the light. My heart began to race. I looked around the room, my eyes darting over the furniture, trying to find the source of the noise, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Just the wind, I whispered to myself. Just my imagination. But I couldn't ignore the rising panic in my chest. I got up and checked the doors, making sure they were locked. I knew it was irrational, nothing had changed, and yet the air around me seemed to thicken, like it was filled with a heaviness that clung to my skin. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath. I sat back down, trying to focus on something else. But that's when I saw it. The crack. It started in the wall, just above the fireplace. At first, it was just a thin, hairline fracture easily overlooked. But the longer I stared at it, the more it seemed to grow. My mind raced. Was I imagining it? Had it always been there? But no, I was sure. This crack was new. It had appeared in the span of just a few minutes. A shiver ran down my spine. I stood up and approached it, running my fingers lightly over the rough edge. It felt real, colder than it should have been. I stepped back and looked at the wall again. The crack had spread, stretching farther than I had noticed before. It was almost like the wall itself was breaking apart, revealing a darkness beneath the surface. I stumbled backward, my mind racing to understand what I was seeing. Was it the house settling? No, this wasn't normal. The crack wasn't just in the wall, it was spreading, moving outward, crawling like a living thing. I could hear the sound again, scraping, shifting, coming from the other side of the room now. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness that seemed to press in closer, suffocating. The crack had grown wider. The wall was no longer solid, it was opening, revealing something behind it. Something dark. The room felt colder now. The air seemed to be pressing in on me, thick with something I couldn't describe. I stepped closer, almost as if drawn to it, my fingers trembling. The darkness that seeped through the crack seemed to be alive, swirling and writhing in ways that made my stomach turn. I reached out, my hand shaking, and touched the edge of the crack. The moment my fingers made contact, a cold shock ran through my body, as though I had just touched ice. The wall gave a low groan, and for a moment, everything went silent. The air, the noise, everything ceased, leaving only a suffocating stillness. And then it came. A whisper. Soft at first, like the faintest breath against my ear. But then it grew louder, clearer. A voice. You shouldn't have looked. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone's voice I recognized. It came from the darkness, from beyond the wall. And it was wrong, so wrong. I backed away, but the room seemed to be closing in on me. The shadows on the floor stretched longer, curling around my feet like tendrils, pulling me toward the crack in the wall. I could hear the scraping sound again, closer now, as if something was trying to crawl out of the very walls. My body tensed in fear, but I couldn't tear myself away. It was as if the darkness had its claws in me, pulling me closer, making me listen to the whisper that was growing louder with every breath. You shouldn't have looked. I blinked, and the world around me shifted. The crack in the wall seemed to widen even further, and something moved inside it, a dark shape, too fast for me to make out. My vision blurred, and the air thickened again. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch further, and the temperature dropped, each breath I took coming out as a cloud of mist. In that moment, I realized this was no ordinary crack in the wall. Something was breaking through. Something had been there all along, just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when I would see it. The room was no longer my own. The floor beneath me was no longer solid. I was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying. The darkness had begun to crawl out from its hiding place, and I was trapped. There was nowhere to run. The whispers grew louder, the walls around me shifting. And as the room collapsed into darkness, I couldn't help but wonder, had I truly seen it, or had it seen me first? I couldn't be sure anymore. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen in place, as though the air had thickened to the point where it was suffocating me, every breath and effort. My chest tightened with an almost unbearable weight, and the only sound was the frantic thumping of my heart. I was still in my living room, but everything had changed. The walls, those same walls I had leaned against for years, seemed wrong now. The space felt stretched, distorted, as though the very foundation of reality had been altered. I didn't know what had happened, or how, but I could feel it, deep in my bones. Something was crawling, shifting beneath the surface of everything I knew. I blinked, but the room didn't return to normal. The crack in the wall had widened, splitting the surface like the skin of a wound, revealing nothing but an impenetrable blackness that seemed to breathe. Each shallow breath I took felt colder than the last. The dark shape that had moved within the crack was now gone, but the shadows seemed to still pulse with an eerie life of their own. "You shouldn't have looked." The whisper came again, but this time it was clearer, sharper, as though it was no longer a mere echo, but something tangible. A presence. A force. It was coming from everywhere. The words felt like fingers on my skin, creeping into my mind, curling around my thoughts. My hands trembled at my sides as I tried to steady myself, but the air around me was so heavy, so oppressive, that I could barely breathe. I forced my feet to move, dragging myself away from the wall and the crack, but it was like fighting against a force far stronger than I was. The floor beneath me felt unstable, like I was walking on sand, or maybe something even worse, something that wasn't quite solid. Every step I took seemed to make the ground shift beneath me, as if the very structure of the house was falling apart around me. "Don't run." The voice was in my head now, clearer than ever, as though it was pulling me deeper into its grasp. I turned my head sharply, searching the room, but I saw nothing. The shadows were still stretching, curling around the edges of the room like they were trying to consume me. I knew then I couldn't escape. There was no way out. Panic surged in my chest. My breath quickened, and I had to fight to stay calm, to think. I ran my hands through my hair, trying to steady myself, trying to understand what was happening. This isn't real. This isn't real. But the crack in the wall, the whispers in my head, the shadows, they were real. Far too real. I stumbled back toward the center of the room, my eyes darting to the door. I had to get out. I had to leave. But every step seemed to bring me closer to the abyss. The walls seemed to be closing in on me, the very air warping and twisting around me. It was as though the house itself was alive, and it was shrinking, squeezing, tightening its grip around me. "Stay with me." The voice was closer now, so close I could almost feel it brushing against my ear. The words were soft, seductive, but full of something darker, something insidious. The walls around me seemed to breathe in rhythm with the voice, pulsing in and out, as though they were alive, aware of me, watching me. The temperature dropped again. I could see my breath now, each exhale forming a thick cloud of mist in front of me. I turned back to the wall, where the crack had grown even wider, the darkness now spilling from it like ink, staining the air. I could feel it drawing me in, pulling at my very soul, wrapping its tendrils around my mind, my thoughts. Don't look away. I froze, my eyes locked on the crack. I could feel the darkness, like it was calling to me, beckoning me to step closer, to dive into its depths. But a small part of me, the last part of me that was still human, knew that if I did, I would never return. Please don't look away. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it was more than just a voice. It was something alive, something ancient. A presence that had been lying in wait, buried beneath the surface of my world, and now it was awake. The crack was no longer just a fracture in the wall, it was a portal, a door to something that shouldn't exist, something that was never meant to be seen. You've already seen it. You can't turn back now. My legs shook, but I couldn't look away. I was drawn to the darkness, to the swirling void that seemed to have no end. I could feel it inside me now, reaching into the very core of my being, pulling at something deep inside me. A fear that was older than the world itself. A fear that knew no boundaries. The room was spinning, the walls breathing faster, as though they were speeding up, trying to overwhelm me. My mind raced. Was this real? Or was I trapped in some waking nightmare, my mind unraveling? I could feel the cracks in my perception starting to show, the seams of reality coming apart around me. I turned away from the wall, finally breaking free of the grip that had held me in place. But the room had changed. The door was no longer in front of me, and the window, my window, was gone. There was only darkness, thick and impenetrable. The very air was heavier, more oppressive, and the sound of my own breath was now drowned by the whispers that filled the space. I couldn't see anything but the darkness, and the shadows that seemed to move just beyond the edges of my vision. Come closer. The voice again, so soft, so insistent. It was almost gentle now, coaxing me, promising that if I just took one more step, everything would make sense. But I knew better. I had to resist. I had to fight. The crack in the wall, the shadows, the voice, they were all part of the same thing, the same presence that had been waiting, patient, for so long. And then, something shifted. A figure appeared, just beyond the crack, standing tall and still, its shape barely visible in the void. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly, like pinpricks of light in an endless sea of black. It didn't move, but I could feel it staring at me, as though it knew everything about me, every fear, every secret. Welcome home. I screamed. I ran. My legs felt like lead, my body sluggish, unresponsive. The room around me swirled and buckled, the walls bending like they were made of rubber, the air thick with a sense of malice. I didn't know where I was going. There was no door, no window, no exit. Only the oppressive weight of the void, creeping closer, following me. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. It was like being submerged in a murky, suffocating pool, unable to breathe, unable to escape. You can't escape me. I stumbled, my heart pounding in my chest. My breathing was shallow, erratic. Sweat soaked my skin, and I could feel the cold seep deeper into my bones, gnawing at me, freezing me from the inside out. My hands clawed at the walls, desperate to steady myself, but there was nothing to hold onto, just the smooth, shifting surface of the house, warping and bending as if it were alive. Don't try to run. The voice, it wasn't just a whisper now. It was a presence, a force, filling the room, surrounding me. It was everywhere. I could feel it in my thoughts, pressing against my mind like a weight, pushing me into submission. The shadows, those crawling, ever-moving shapes, were growing, spreading, creeping over the floor, the ceiling, the walls. They seemed to be alive, pulsating, writhing, closing in on me. I could feel them tightening around my chest, my throat, squeezing the life out of me. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in from all sides, and there was nowhere left to go. I closed my eyes, desperate for some semblance of reality, for the comforting touch of the familiar. But the more I fought it, the more the darkness consumed me. Look at me. I opened my eyes, drawn unwillingly to the figure standing at the edge of the room, just out of reach. The presence had shifted. Now it was standing upright, fully formed, taller than any human being should be, its shape impossibly tall and thin. The light from the cracks in the wall did nothing to reveal its true form. All I could see were those glowing eyes, those piercing, empty voids that seemed to stare straight into my soul. It was as if the figure existed beyond reality, an entity that belonged in a place far removed from anything I had ever known. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge it, to accept its presence. You're already mine. I tried to speak, to scream, to plead, but no words came. My mouth felt dry, parched. The air was thick, almost gelatinous, and each breath I took felt heavier than the last. I could feel the weight of the room pressing down on me, as if the very structure of reality was collapsing, folding in on itself. Don't be afraid. The voice was low, soothing, like a whisper in the back of my mind. It sounded so kind, so familiar, like a comfort I never asked for. But I could feel the darkness in it, the coldness beneath the surface. The gentle tone only made it more terrifying. It was drawing me in, making me want to surrender, making me want to stop fighting, to let go and accept whatever this was. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I pushed against the walls, against the floor, against the air itself, desperate to move, to escape. But my body was paralyzed, trapped in place. I felt as if my mind was beginning to crack, splinter, shattering under the pressure of the presence that was now so close, so real. I am not here to hurt you. The words were so soft, but they sent a chill down my spine. They were filled with a strange, unsettling calm. I could feel the void stretching behind them, like a cold abyss that threatened to swallow everything I was, everything I knew. The shadows, the figure, the whispers, they were all part of the same thing. The presence had always been there, beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break free, to pull me into its fold. The crack in the wall, the twisted air, the distortion of the room, they were the physical manifestation of that darkness, that ancient force that had existed far longer than I could comprehend. It wasn't just in my house, it was inside me. I have always been inside you. The voice echoed in my mind, and I froze. I could feel it now, spreading like a virus, curling around my thoughts, suffocating them. The presence had been with me all along, buried beneath the surface of my mind, waiting for the right moment to break free. The figure took a step forward, its long limbs stretching impossibly thin, the glow of its eyes growing brighter, sharper. I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing into me, digging into my soul, tearing through everything I thought I knew. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The presence had me, trapped in its gaze, ensnared in its web. And then, everything stopped. The room went silent. The whispers faded. The air, once thick and oppressive, was now still, cold. For a brief moment, everything was normal again. But I knew it wasn't real. It couldn't be. The silence was a lie. The darkness was still there, just waiting to return. I am always here, beneath the surface. The voice was everywhere now, inside my head, in my bones, in my blood. And I knew that I would never be free. I was awake. I had to be. But the reality around me felt distorted, warped, like looking through a cracked mirror where everything was just slightly off. The room, the air, even the light had changed. The walls were no longer the same soft yellow they had been before. Now they loomed with an oppressive gray hue, darkened in places as if something had seeped into the very fabric of the house. My breath came in shallow gasps, but I didn't know whether it was because of the dark presence still lingering in the corners of my mind or because I was still tangled in the aftermath of what I had just experienced. It wasn't over. I rose shakily from the bed, my body trembling, feeling heavy and foreign. My feet touched the floor, but it felt colder than before, as though the warmth had been drained out of the very ground beneath me. A strange weight pressed down on my chest, like something was suffocating me from within. The more I tried to shake it off, the more it clung to me, suffused through my thoughts, like ink slowly spreading on paper. I glanced toward the window. The sun should have been setting, it should have been late evening by now, but the sky outside was a sickly shade of pale gray. The clouds churned, swirling in unnatural patterns, as though the heavens themselves were twisting, unraveling. A sound, a sharp crack, echoed through the room, and I froze. It came from somewhere beneath the floorboards, distant yet close enough to make my pulse quicken. I couldn't place it at first, but the noise was unmistakable, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Like someone, or something, moving underneath me. The sound grew louder, closer, like footsteps dragging against wood, crawling toward me, inch by agonizing inch. I had to move. I had to get out of here. But the moment I made a step toward the door, I felt it, the presence. It wasn't physical. It wasn't something I could touch or see, but it was there, somewhere just beneath the surface. A shift in the air, a change in the way the light flickered, like the room was holding its breath. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, like they were reaching out to ensnare me, pulling at my feet, whispering words I couldn't fully understand. My mind raced, and yet there was no way to make sense of what was happening. My fingers trembled as I reached for the doorknob, the cold metal sending a jolt of panic through me. Don't go outside. The voice. It was there again. Soft, coaxing, almost like it had always been a part of the room, waiting for me to listen. But I couldn't listen to it anymore. I wouldn't. I twisted the knob, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt as if something was pressing against it from the other side. My pulse thudded in my ears as I tried again, harder this time, using all my strength. The door creaked, but still, it didn't open. You can't leave. A low, guttural laugh came from the other side of the door, sending a wave of nausea through me. I stumbled back, my legs giving out from under me, sending me crashing to the floor. My heart hammered in my chest as I gasped for breath, trying to calm myself, but the fear wouldn't leave. It felt like it was clinging to me, wrapping around me, sinking its claws deeper and deeper. I was trapped. But the question was no longer about the door, it was about everything else. Was it really the house holding me prisoner, or was it something inside me? Something that had been there all along, buried deep beneath the surface, hidden from view? Something that had woken up in the dark corners of my mind? I crawled toward the window, desperate to see something familiar, something that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. But when I looked outside, all I saw was emptiness. There was no street, no trees, no houses. Just an endless expanse of gray, a void stretching on forever. There's nowhere to run. I turned back to face the room. The shadows had grown, now taking on more defined shapes, swirling and twisting around me. The tapping had stopped, but something else was now growing louder, the faint sound of breathing, ragged and heavy, coming from the darkness. The walls seemed to tremble in response, vibrating with an energy I couldn't understand. I told you, you can't leave. I tried to rise, to move, to get away from the oppressive weight pressing down on me. But it was no use. The room felt smaller now, closing in on me, shrinking with each passing second. I was suffocating, trapped, and I could feel the panic rising within me again. But then, through the shadows, a figure appeared. It was humanoid in shape, but its edges were blurred, shifting, as though it wasn't entirely real. It stood motionless for a moment before slowly, deliberately, beginning to move toward me. Its form seemed to absorb the light, leaving only a faint outline, a silhouette that became clearer with every step it took. It had no face, no features, just an empty space where a face should be. It's you. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My body froze, my blood turning to ice as the realization washed over me. The presence, the thing I had been avoiding, denying, was me. It was always me. What I feared, what I tried to run from, what I couldn't escape, it had always been inside, hidden beneath the surface of my own mind. The shadows, the voices, the whispers, they were all fragments of my own thoughts, my own fear. The thing standing before me wasn't some external force, some evil entity. It was me, broken, distorted, a version of myself that I had buried deep in the recesses of my mind. I am you. The words echoed in the hollow of my mind, reverberating through the very air around me. The room spun as the figure grew closer, its shape no longer an indistinct blur, but something solid, something I recognized, my own reflection, twisted and wrong. And then it spoke again. We are one. The world around me shattered. The world around me collapsed. The very air seemed to splinter, breaking into 1,000 jagged shards, each piece catching the fading light of my fading reality. The figure, me, loomed over me, its shape warping, stretching, until it no longer resembled anything human. It was something darker, a silhouette of nightmares, a distortion of everything I had ever feared. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was constricted, a vice tightening with each breath. My hands, shaking, unrecognizable, tried to reach out, but the space around me was shrinking, folding in like an endless black void. The figure took another step toward me, its presence overwhelming. It wasn't just moving, it was merging with the very walls, the floor, the ceiling. I couldn't escape. There was no door, no window, no way out. You can't run from this. The voice, or perhaps it was my voice, echoed from all around me, inside me, through me. It was impossible to tell anymore. It wasn't just a presence, it was a thought, a feeling, a whisper that existed within the very marrow of my bones. The room, if it was even a room anymore, had begun to distort further. The walls bent at impossible angles, the floor twisted like it was made of liquid. The shadows, once vague and fleeting, were now solid, pulsating, like they were alive, breathing in rhythm with my own panicked heartbeat. They crawled across the floor, slithering like creatures from the depths of some forgotten abyss, their shapes too terrible to fully comprehend. Look at us. Look at what you've done. The words slithered into my ears, clawing their way into my mind, dragging out everything I had buried, everything I had tried to ignore. The guilt. The fear. The moments when I had turned away from myself, from the truth. The moments when I had buried my own darkness so deep, thinking it would never resurface. But it had. And now it was here, right in front of me, pulling at the edges of my sanity. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. My feet slipped on the shifting ground, the air thickening, pressing down on me from all sides. The darkness grew heavier, more suffocating. My vision blurred, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure, me, was still advancing, and with each step, its form became clearer. The features, or lack thereof, were now unmistakable. Its body was my own, but twisted, corrupted, its edges blurred as though it was being erased from existence. "This is the real you," the voice whispered. "The truth you've been running from. The truth you never wanted to see." I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, trying to shut away the reality that was closing in on me. But even with my eyes shut, I could feel it, feel the figure's presence pressing against me. It wasn't just in front of me, it was inside me, a part of me, an extension of everything I had ignored, every part of myself I had tried to bury. "You cannot escape. We are the same." The words pierced through me like a blade, sharp and final. And for the first time, I understood. The terror, the overwhelming feeling of being watched, of being suffocated, it wasn't something external. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the darkness. It was me. All of it was me. I had built this cage. I had created this nightmare. The figure finally reached me, and as it did, I felt an overwhelming sensation of cold, a cold that was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just physical, it was a freezing, hollow emptiness that spread through every part of me. I wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but I knew, on some deep, primal level, that it was futile. The figure raised its hand, and for a moment, I thought it was going to strike me. But instead, it touched my face, gently, almost lovingly, as if it was trying to comfort me. "There is no escaping what you are." And with that, the world shattered once more. The floor beneath me gave way, and I fell. But this time, there was no ground to catch me. I plummeted, faster and faster, deeper into the black abyss. The darkness was endless. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My body was weightless, adrift in an infinite sea of nothingness. And then, suddenly, the darkness receded. It didn't vanish, it just faded, like a storm finally passing. I was still falling, but the sensation of terror had eased. It was replaced with something colder, something worse. Silence. A silence so deep it felt like it was consuming me. And then, I heard it. A voice. "You're still here." It wasn't my voice. It wasn't the figures. It was something else. Something ancient. "You're still here." The words reverberated in the dark, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I had never truly left. The darkness beneath the surface had never gone away. It had only been waiting for me to acknowledge it. And now I had. There was no escape. There never had been. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.